Good evening and welcome everybody to our 9th virtual event. We're very delighted to welcome Andrew. Everybody probably knows quite a lot about Andrew. He's been in the news over many, many years, but maybe don't know that he has very, very strong connections to Oxford, which started when he went to Kingham School and then subsequently attended Keble College, where he got a BA in modern history, then a DPhil from Christ Church, and was elected a fellow in history and politics at Nuffield College. And Andrew also started his political career in Oxford as a city councillor for North Ward, firstly as SDP and then Liberal Democrats. And then in 2005, he was made a Labour peer and has held several key roles in the Labour government, including head of Number 10 Policy Unit for Tony Blair. In addition to being a journalist and an author of several books, some of which are on my bookshelf, you'll be pleased to know, in March 2021, Andrew assumed office as chair of the European movement, where he has just literally come hot foot from a committee meeting. And in this role, Andrew has very strong grassroots-driven agenda that we can all sign up to campaign for the complete reversal of Brexit in the earliest practical timescale. And in 23rd of June this year, Andrew wrote, "I still believe Brexit will be reversed entirely in this generation." And I'll hand over to Andrew to show us how we can do this, ideally in 3 easy steps, if you don't mind. Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you. It's great to be with you. It's always great to be virtually, if not physically, in Oxford. A large part of my life, I lived in Oxford for 10 years as various different stages of my academic career, and as you said, Susan, as a counsellor, which I hugely enjoyed, and I still think of Oxford extremely fondly. And Oxford, I think, has one of the largest European movement organisations in the country, and rightly so, because the whole lifeblood of Oxford, being internationalist, being pro-European, being a location of researchers and workers from across Europe and Brits who engage in Europe very openly. Its whole ethos, lifeblood, and philosophy is internationalist and European, and rightly so, because it represents the best interests of the country. So it's great to be with you in Oxford, and I took on the chairmanship of the European movement when I was asked to do so, because I think it's probably, in terms of public policy, the most important issue still facing the country. It's abundantly clear that Brexit isn't finished business. Boris Johnson's Brexit deal isn't even stable. He said Brexit was done, but it manifestly isn't done. There's a crisis on the border with Northern Ireland, and the government itself, Lord Frost, who I engage in combat with every week in the House of Lords. Lord Frost came to the House of Lords just before Parliament was adjourned last week to announce that the government itself wants to reopen the Brexit deal. It wants to completely renegotiate all of the arrangements to do with Ireland and Northern Ireland. And since they involve the whole of the basis of the Brexit deal, whether or not there is going to be an open border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, and that can only be on the basis of the Northern Ireland Protocol, unless Great Britain as a whole comes back into the customs union and the single market, which is what I think should happen. We talk about step by step towards rejoin, which is the European movement's slogan, which I think is correct. I think the big building blocks towards rejoin will be going back into the customs union and the single market. The only credible way of doing what the government itself says is its own objective, which is having no customs controls and therefore border controls, north, south and east, west in respect of Northern Ireland, is to come into the customs union and the single market. So it isn't stable, the current settlement. The government itself has said that it wants to reform it, and we have ideas as to how it should be reformed. Indeed, the government itself getting, the cart before the horse, as it does so often. Now that we have signed the trade and cooperation agreement and are saying that we want to renegotiate it, the government has just advertised for a post called the Director of the Opportunities of Brexit. Now, as I said to Lord Frost in an exchange in the House of Lords 2 weeks ago now, I'd be very happy to apply for that post. I told him I would do it for nothing. He said that the post is being advertised for a salary of 120,000 a year, apparently with 5 or 6 deputies as well. And they're asking for suggestions as to what the successful candidates would like to do, because they don't know what the opportunities of Brexit are at the moment. So I told Lord Frost I'd be very happy to apply for it. I didn't need a salary. I would do it for nothing as chair of the European movement. And I had a plan that the thing which the Director of the Opportunities for Brexit should do in order to make Brexit a success is to immediately apply to rejoin the customs union and the single market. That would at least stabilise the current Brexit deal. It would mean that the supposed opportunities of Brexit, which are to have more trade, not less trade, can be realised. And we could then also stabilise the situation in Northern Ireland, which is the immediate crisis, because being in the customs union and the single market would mean that you need no customs and border controls north, south and east, west. Lord Frost told me he didn't think I necessarily fulfilled the person's specifications for the role. So I'm afraid it doesn't look as though I'm going to be fulfilling that role. But anyway, I look forward to seeing who they do get into it. But the key point is that the current situation isn't stable. We're right to be campaigning for step by step towards rejoin. It's very clear to me that the big steps will be rejoining the customs union and a large part of the single market. And that's what we should be campaigning for and are campaigning for. Now, in terms of how we get there at the moment, as I say, the situation isn't stable and things could move at any time. But there are clearly big campaigns on the bits of the trade and cooperation agreement which simply won't work at the moment in their own terms. And the biggest of those is the Northern Ireland border, which raises big questions, as I say, about the relationship with the customs union and the single market. But there's also the rights of workers to work on the continent, professional people to work, artists, musicians, engineers, architects, and which at the moment aren't safeguarded. And that is, the government says that it wants to resolve that issue, but it has no proposals to resolve it. And again, I think it's only by some closer arrangement with the customs union and the single market that can be done. Erasmus, the government said it was going to be part of Erasmus. It gave it an undertaking, the Conservative Party gave an undertaking in its manifesto that it would be part of that, and it's now gone back on that. Well, again, that's not a stable relationship either. And we've still got the issue, which I think is only in the early stages of being resolved at the moment, as to what happens in respect of all of those EU citizens, non-British EU citizens who are resident in the United Kingdom. Now, there's an excellent organisation which was called, I think is still called formally, the 3 million, but actually it turns out that 5.3 million is a huge number of EU citizens who are resident in Britain but don't have British citizenship, have applied for settled status. Well, the closing date for applying for settled status was the end of last month. They are still only in the early stages of processing all those applications, and I suspect that there's going to be a very large set of issues as they start processing them, including amongst those who, for one reason or another, which in the context of COVID could be a perfectly good reason, haven't applied. And I think the European movement will need to be taking up those issues in due course. So there are a number of immediate issues of great urgency, which I think will constitute the first steps in our campaign of step by step towards rejoin. In terms of the European movement itself, which I'm privileged to chair, the way I think we need to proceed is a dual strategy at the moment. The first strategy is to be campaigning on these issues, but the second is to be gathering our own strength. My mission as your chair is that we should be an organisation of at least 100,000 members. We should be a mass membership organisation. Those of you who are on this call who aren't members of the European movement, I really do strongly urge you to join, because we are only as strong nationally as our membership. And at the moment, we have a big gap between our national membership, which is now over 13,000, which is a big increase. We were under 1,000 at the time of the referendum in 2016 in terms of national members. We're now over 13,000. We've signed up more than 1,000 in the last 6 weeks. So we are increasing. But we have just over 13,000 members, but we have more than 100,000 registered supporters, and our branches and affiliates which includes Oxford for Europe, have nearly 200,000 names on various databases. And if we could translate all of those supporters in one guise or another, whether they're nationally registered or parts of our local branches and affiliates, if we could translate them into European movement members, that would give me and all those campaigning on behalf of the European movement a huge amount more sway. It will give us more sway in the national media. It will give us more sway in our dealings with the political parties, including, crucially, Labour, the Lib Dems, the Greens, and the nationalist parties, the opposition parties, who at the moment, in various different ways, are keeping the European issue at arm's length because they're worried that it's a toxic issue for them politically. The stronger we are, the more that they will engage with us. And in due course, I think it will also have a big impact on the Conservative Party, because the reason why the Conservatives have gone down this route, because they are absolutely focused at every stage, the Conservative Party always has been on winning and holding power, is that the judgment which successive Conservative leaders have made, up to and including Boris Johnson, who is abundantly clear, he doesn't believe in Brexit as a cause as such, he just believes in things that are popular, which will get him elected, is the judgment they've made all the way through, that there is a majority behind Brexit. The moment we can demonstrate that that's not the case, I think not only will the opposition parties start to move, and 13,000 members, the Lib Dems total membership is only about 60,000, and I think the Greens is about half that at the moment. So if we could get to 100,000 members, we would have more members than the Lib Dems and the Greens, and we'd have a very substantial membership to match the Labour parties as well. And I think then we would really get a seat at the table in terms of discussions with them. So I think it's a twin track strategy that we need to engage in. Campaigning our local branches and affiliates and the national organisation on step-by-step towards rejoin, which is the Northern Ireland border, the 3 million, Erasmus, fisheries, which is a huge crisis issue at the moment, artists, musicians and other professionals, all of those crisis issues that there are at the moment, step by step, leading to what I think is the position we want to be seeking to encourage the opposition parties to adopt at the next general election, which is rejoining the customs union and as much of the single market as possible, which of course depend upon a negotiation with the European Union. I would hope that would include, for example, freedom of movement as a key part of the single market. But then the separate track is to make the European movement as an organisation as powerful as possible, which means, to be blunt, as many members as possible and as big an income as possible, so that we really do carry big political weight with the media and with the political parties. And I think that will enable us to move much faster on this step-by-step towards rejoin. On that basis, I'm an optimist, because though it's been a very grim 5 years, there has only been one vote specifically on the issue of Brexit in those 5 years. We had 2 general elections, but those general elections, frustratingly, were about the issue of who the voters wanted to lead the country. And it was never any surprise to me that they didn't want Jeremy Corbyn to become Prime Minister. To be blunt, I didn't particularly want Jeremy Corbyn to become Prime Minister either, but I also didn't want Brexit to happen. The judgment that the country made was that they, first of all, would rather have had Theresa May and then second time round Boris Johnson as Prime Minister than Jeremy Corbyn, but they weren't specifically asked to give their view on the Brexit issue, and they couldn't on that binary choice between who they wanted to become Prime Minister. The only occasion on which the country was asked to give a judgment on Brexit was in 2016, before there'd been any negotiations and there were any withdrawal proposals before the country. And as soon as national debate and started to focus on actual proposals which were being negotiated, at every stage after that, opinion polls showed a majority against those proposals. And it's still the case today that even after Brexit has been quote unquote done, the polls show that the country is split about 50-50 on whether or not they think it's been a good idea. And the only reason, to my mind, why there's as much as 50% or thereabouts who support the status quo at the moment is because people are very worried about reopening the issue so quickly. So what we are doing, I think, is profoundly right in terms of the national interest. The fact that we are at a 50-50 position shows why I think it would be perfectly possible for us to carry a majority in due course behind rejoining. But our strategy, our twin-track strategy of campaigning on the particular issues which are failing in the Brexit deal, making that the first steps towards rejoining, of which the big steps would be rejoining the customs union and the single market, and in parallel to that, building up our European movement as strongly as possible so that we become as powerful as possible a national campaigning force. That is the right strategy. It's one I think that will win. I can't say precisely what the timescale will be, but I think that that will in due course become the majority view, probably the settled view of the country at large. And like so many of the great civilizing causes which spread across the country at large, they start in our great university cities. And it's therefore highly appropriate that Oxford should be in the lead on these issues because it generally is in advance of mainstream public opinion on these great issues to do with the enlightened future of the country. So it's great to be with you in the last meeting before we all head off for the summer. I hope I've given you some sense of a serious game plan and a sense of optimism as to how we can deliver it. We're only at the early stages of step-by-step towards rejoin at the moment, but I think it's absolutely achievable, but only if we turn ourselves into the strongest possible national campaigning force, building out from our local branches and affiliated organisations like Oxford for Europe. So Peter and Susan, thanks very much for hosting this meeting. I see we've got 140 people on the call, which is a huge tribute to you in terms of your reach and engagement at 8 o'clock on a summer's evening at the very end of July. And I'd be really delighted to take your questions and comments now as we get a discussion going.
Thank you very much, Andrew. That's really, really helpful. And obviously, one of the things that has come away from that is that size really does matter. So we obviously need to build our numbers as much as we can. So we've got question and answer questions coming in that are being voted up, and Peter is, and we've had some that came in earlier. So Peter is going to fire the questions at you, if that's okay, Andrew. Many thanks, Peter.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, super, as always, Andrew. I mean, you're a great friend of Oxford. You've been here many times, I know, and you've always been very inspiring. You've always been somebody who has made people think and made people actually take action. And I think that's the important thing, is that we all feel the incentive to keep on going, even at times when maybe things are looking a little grim. And I'm absolutely sure it's achievable that we will reach the 100,000 threshold in the European movement under your very capable leadership. I also liked very much your offer to Lord Frost. Not that it was tongue-in-cheek or anything, but I think he got his just desserts there, and I'm sure he was he had no ready answer for you. So onto the Q&A, and I'll just start with what was by far the most popular question, and I think it's something that's probably quite close to your heart as well, but I'd be interested. So this is a question from Ian Delaford. What do you think about focusing on proportional representation as suggested by Professor A.C. Grayling?
I support, PR, I support the German system, the mixed member system, which it's important to understand, we, the British, when we were creating the Federal Republic of Germany, Ernie Bevan, my biography of Ernie Bevan out recently, there's a whole section on the work that was done very successfully on the forging of the German Constitution. I wish we'd done as good a job on the British Constitution as we did on the German Constitution, because the two fundamental features of the German Constitution are devolution, the principle of subsidiarity, the creation of what are now 16 states in Germany, each with their own Land, their Länder, each with their own Land parliament, as well as the federation, and both the state parliaments, the land parliaments, and the federal parliament are elected by a mixed member proportional system, which was deliberately designed to get the best of the British electoral system, which is having members of parliament who represent geographical areas, which is important in terms of giving geographical representation, and somebody who is emphatically there in parliament representing Oxford, Reading, all the districts of London and so on, but also having a top up to ensure fair proportionality over a threshold of 5%. That is the mixed member system. And it's actually the system which we devised in conjunction with German jurists for the German Basic Law in 1949 to get the best of the British system and the best of PR, learning from the problem of the Weimar Constitution, which was pure proportionality, including very, very small parties, well below 5%, which led to undue fragmentation. And it didn't have strong geographical representation. And it also didn't have a viable system of devolution. Because remember, one of the first things that Hitler does is essentially to abolish the states. What I would like to see is our constitution much more like the German constitution in both respects, proportional representation and proper federalism across the United Kingdom. Whereas at the moment, we have quasi-federalism and quasi-PR. We have federalism in respect of Northern Ireland, England and Wales, and we have PR for the parliaments or assemblies in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. The German system, it was the Blair government of which I was a part, which introduced the German system into those parliaments and assemblies, which is the reason why the SNP, with whatever it was, 49% of the vote, didn't get a majority of the seats in the Scottish Parliament. If they'd had the Westminster electoral system, they'd have something like 80 or 90% of the seats with 49% of the votes. So we do, in a sort of classically unsatisfactorily uncodified way in the United Kingdom at the moment, have elements of these more advanced systems, PR and devolution, but they haven't been spread across the UK, and I think they should be so, and I certainly support that.
Well, thank you very much, and I can speak with some passion about this. I'm currently in Westport in Ireland, and I grew up in Ireland, where of course we had the PR system, STV system to be exact, ever since independence, and it was introduced actually to a great extent by the departing British rulers. So it's clearly something that they found, British governments have found suitable for other countries, if not their own. I noticed that part of Boris Johnson's current, dare I say, power grab consists of trying to take away the proportional representation systems for mayoral elections and elsewhere, which I think would be deeply regrettable. But thank you for that answer, and I think it's very much something that we all strive for. I'll move on to the next question, if I might. And this one comes from Roy Mottram of Tame. So the Tory government's unlikely to move closer to the EU. So should we be campaigning on PR? But further to that, how can we get Labour to move in that direction?
Well, there's the majority of Labour Party members, and I say this with some feeling because I meet them all the time, are strongly pro-European and don't support the decision which was taken by the Labour leadership to vote for Boris Johnson's trade and cooperation agreement. And indeed, quite a number of MPs and peers either abstained or, in the case of quite a number of peers, voted against it. I voted against it in the House of Lords. I thought it was a completely unsatisfactory agreement which didn't deliver Boris Johnson's own objectives. Indeed, he now accepts that himself, because the trade and cooperation agreement is the one he is now trying to disown, because he's not prepared to implement the Northern Ireland Protocol, which he and Lord Frost themselves negotiated. So I think it was a really serious mistake of the Labour leadership to vote for the trade and cooperation agreement, and it isn't supported, I can tell you, by the overwhelming majority of Labour members. So the question inside the Labour Party is how we can get the leadership to start reflecting the membership. That's the fundamental issue. And if I can be blunt about it, the louder the voice of the European movement, including Labour Party members within the European movement, the more they will have to listen. And the Cheshire and Amersham by-election, I think, was quite important in that respect. That demonstrated that it's perfectly possible to be pro-European and to beat the Conservatives in elections. Keir Starmer got himself into a position, unfortunately, of thinking that the Red Wall, which is this group of seats in the Midlands and the North, which voted heavily for Brexit, that was the only constituency he had to appeal to. Now, as it happens, I don't think Brexit was the first and foremost issue, even in those areas. The problem in those areas I know well, because I visited them as minister time and time again, and actually in my Brexit campaigning, is what they want is a plan for economic revival. The big problem in the parts of the Midlands and the North that voted for Brexit is economic decline. It's lack of jobs, lack of opportunities, poor prospects for young people. That's what needs sorting. And what happened, unfortunately and tragically, is that Brexit became the scapegoat for that. Brussels became the scapegoat. And what's needed is a proper economic plan for those areas. And what I've said this to Keir personally, that what we should be seeking to do is to produce that economic plan, not playing along with the very scapegoating of Brussels and Europe, which is in fact going to make these areas even poorer. And what Chesham and Amersham showed is that despite all those arguments about the Midlands and the North, well, as I say, I don't think it was right to be supporting Brexit anyway, there was also a vast constituency which is much larger, particularly in terms of places that are likely to vote Labour, where they don't support Brexit and where they're strongly concerned, deeply concerned about the direction that Boris Johnson is taking the country. And the Chesham and Amersham by-election demonstrated that, because you had the most pro-European of the main opposition parties, the Lib Dems, who won a landslide against the Conservatives in a traditional Conservative seats, at the same time as Labour was losing seats. So I think the stronger the European movement and Labour members are in the European movement, the more it will get Labour to move. I was very struck that Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor, the new Shadow Chancellor, in today's Financial Times, was saying that we needed to engage much more closely with the EU, which I took to be code for saying that maybe we should be looking to renegotiate the trade and cooperation agreement. And that's the crucial breakthrough that we need in terms of the Labour Party's attitude. The big problem is, having voted for the trade and cooperation agreement, it's very hard for Keir to call for its renegotiation. And that has to be the first step. Once you accept and call in principle for it to be renegotiated, the question then is, what should it be renegotiated to do? Now, I'm enough of a realist to know you couldn't obviously renegotiate the trade and cooperation agreement in one go to re-enter the European Union. I mean, that isn't going to happen in one go. But you could put on the agenda that your renegotiation could be for re-entry into the customs union and a large part of the single market. That's a perfectly plausible basis for negotiations with the European Union, which after all is akin to the arrangements that Norway and Switzerland have, which emphatically do not require membership of the European Union itself. So that, I think, is the critical thing that we need to get established, which I saw Rachel Reeves as starting to move towards, which is accepting the principle of renegotiation rather than the position which Keir Starmer mistakenly got him into of actually supporting the trade and cooperation agreement. We've got to move from that position to calling for renegotiation, and that's what we all need to be doing in the European movement. Now, in Oxford, you have a Labour MP. Indeed, you have the in Annalisa Dodds, you have a very strongly, in terms of her personal feelings, pro-European person. She's a former member of the European Parliament, who is in charge of Labour's policy review. Now, I can assure you, the stronger the European movement in Oxford presents itself to Annalisa Dodds on this issue, the more she will listen. So you actually, in terms of local campaigning, you really need to make Annalisa a target of the campaigning, because she is the single most influential person besides Keir himself and what the next Labour manifesto is going to say. And I know what I want the next Labour manifesto to say. Renegotiate the trade and cooperation agreement to re-enter the customs union and as much of the single market as we can get, and put that to her as a proposition. No ifs, no buts. That's what we need. There you are. That's a campaigning suggestion for you.
I'm very glad you said that, Andrew, because I mean, we have been knocking at Annalisa's door on a regular basis, and you know, I think she listens. The next step is actually to respond, but. Thank you for that.
Roy has asked, I didn't answer the question about how do we get Labour to support PR. Yeah. I think it's much easier to get Labour to support PR, by the way, in terms of being prepared to entertain it, because Keir himself has already said that he's open to considering change the electoral system. He's been much more forthcoming on PR than he has on renegotiating Brexit. So the question there is, when he says he's open-minded on it, what does he mean? What would be the process? That's the critical issue. And I think my own view, if I can offer it to you, is that what we should have is some form of constitutional convention that should consider the electoral system, but also federal arrangements for the United Kingdom as a whole, which Gordon Brown is overseeing work on behalf of the Labour Party for. But at the moment is only looking at the federal issues. And in my view, he should also look at the electoral system as part of that. And it might well be that it could even be the European movement, but certainly those who are keenly interested in this issue should, I think, as a first big step forward, make representations to Gordon Brown in his capacity as chairing the constitutional review that Keir Starmer has set up.
Thank you. Can I just ask a supplementary on that one? Because, I mean, you've mentioned quite a few practical steps Labour could take, but what about calling for closer alignment on SPS standards in order to try to salvage the Northern Ireland situation? Is that a realistic intermediate goal before looking to rejoining the single market and customs union?
I think the government may be forced into it because without an SPS deal, there will be no exports of agricultural and fisheries-related exports. There simply won't be, and that's now become very clear. And the government is saying it's seeking to find a way forward on that. Now, Frost, because Lord Frost and I've had long exchanges about this, we're in this theological debate at the moment between what's called dynamic alignment and mutual recognition. He says that we would be prepared to engage in mutual recognition, that is, that we would recognise each other's standards, but he's not prepared to agree to dynamic alignment, which is that we would agree to align with changing EU standards. Now, since at the moment our standards are the same, because we haven't changed them, there is no reason at the moment why the two couldn't be the same thing. That mutual recognition is alignment. So the issue is the word dynamic, and the word dynamic only comes into play at the point at which either side wants to diverge. Either we want to diverge because we want different standards, maybe as part of a trade deal, the mythical trade deal with the United States, or the EU wants to diverge because it wants to introduce new and different standards. But neither of those are the case at the moment. And I've got a feeling that that may be the ultimate deal with some face-saving form of words that makes it clear on the part of the EU that they are not in any way constrained from changing their standards as they see fit. And on the British side, that we're not in any way constrained to following them if they do change them. I think that may be the ultimate way forward, with some new phrase which somebody will come up with, which in fact is an agreement of mutual recognition of standards, which is alignment, but doesn't commit either side to agree to the other's changes indefinitely. But at the moment, Frost is refusing to agree anything on this front. And I think that is ultimately going to be his undoing. Because the thing that is undoing his trade and cooperation agreement at the moment is its unworkability. And it clearly isn't workable. It's not a stable situation to have a trade and cooperation agreement that stifles trade and ensures no cooperation. And he's got that on the SPS issue. He's got that in respect of the Northern Ireland border at the moment. He's got that in respect of artists and musicians in particular. So since that isn't a stable situation, I think in all of those areas he's going to be forced into a renegotiation.
Thank you. I think the rock principle is the word that comes to mind, isn't it? Speaking of Lord Frost. But I'm going to skip over the next two questions because I think to some extent they've been addressed in the answers you've given already. I'm going to move on to the question from Rainer Hillebrand. And he says, how can we compete with the Murdoch press?
Well, the Murdoch press in one respect is becoming less significant because the circulation of the Sun has been falling very steadily. I think the Murdoch press is probably less significant now than it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Our problem, I think, is
Express, etc. as well.
Yeah, but they're not hugely. But I think our problem actually at the moment is twofold. It's the Conservative Party. We have the major party of the state and the government, which is fiercely against us. And we've had a long and ongoing problem with the BBC. And what the government is trying to do, I think, is much more concerning than the Murdoch press, is it's trying to neuter the BBC, literally neuter it. They're trying to put Paul Dacre in as the chairman of Ofcom, which is the regulator of the BBC. They put ardent pro-conservatives onto the board of the BBC, who are responsible for editorial standards on the BBC, and the appointment of senior BBC staff. And the biggest threat, I think, to us in terms of being able to get a fair and balanced hearing in the national debates in the immediate future is stopping the BBC becoming neutered, which may happen if we're not careful. I would dearly like to see a more plural newspaper sector. As part of the reason why I've been such an ardent supporter of the New European is that we need our, as it were, ardent protagonists out there in the media. Rupert Murdoch himself is not immortal. And when the time comes for transition in that respect, I don't think it's clear that the Murdoch empire will survive. It could be that all different bits of it are sold off. At the moment, there's no logical fit between the Sun and the Times here, for example. So it could be that you get more plurality simply by virtue of the bits of the Murdoch empire being sold. Of course, Sky has already gone from his portfolio anyway. But there were one or two encouraging signs. I've watched with glee and huge, almost hilarity, the collapse of GB News, which was supposed to be the British Fox and lost its anchor within a month and is now all but disintegrated. Indeed, for several days, the week before last, it had zero ratings, that so few people were watching it, it wasn't even detectable. And they haven't yet been able to get Paul Dacre through. They'd been trying to get him through as chairman of Ofcom, but they couldn't even get him past the Independent Civil Service people who were vetting the appointment. So it's possible at the moment, it's not a done deal. He's going to be able to get his Tory partisans taking over the media regulator. So all is not doom and gloom. There are positive signs as well as signs of great concern, and we should play for the positives as hard as we can.
Thank you for that. I'm going to ask a question that I'm sure is on the minds of many of the people watching this, which is behind your left shoulder.
Behind my shoulder is Gladstone, who was also a great European. He talked long before it was fashionable about the concert of Europe and arbitration and partnership between European states. Of course, he was a liberal, so he wanted the other European states to be constitutionally governed. Remember, he described the Bourbons in Naples as the negation of God erected into a system of government. So he was a great man. He had weaknesses too, but for his time, he was advanced.
Can I ask the next question from Kenneth Lambden? What do you make of the views of Dominic Cummings when he was interviewed by Laura Kunzberg? And he said he didn't know if leaving the EU was the right thing to do, and nobody knows the answer to that. How do you feel about, I suppose, more broadly, the whole Cummings affair and what lessons there are to learn from it?
Well, that's encouraging. Obviously, it would be great if he'd said that before 2016, because we might have won the referendum if he said he wasn't sure that the cause he was campaigning for was a good idea. The point about it, because he and I have been exchanging barbed exchanges on Twitter, and indeed he did his last blog was partly about me saying I was deluded in thinking that we could ever rejoin, is that what he's saying is that no reasonable person, this is his argument now, is that no reasonable person can be sure that Brexit is a good idea. Now, actually, I turn that round and say that no reasonable person could have confidence that Brexit was a sensible thing to be proceeding with 5 years ago or any time since. Whereas a reasonable person could then and at every stage since think that Brexit was not a good idea a reasonable person, not a fanatical person, but a reasonable person, for two very good reasons. The first is that the status quo works, and the second is it was an undeniable fact on all independent assessments that the key issues which were of concern, namely trade and economic prosperity, were not going to be safeguarded by Brexit. So a reasonable person would have thought Brexit shouldn't be proceeded with. So as I've been saying, reasonable people were absolutely correct to think that Brexit was a bad idea. And the fact that he says he's not even sure, as the person who was proposing it, that it was a good idea, shows that the balance of argument was heavily against Brexit. It was then, and it is now. The other thing that's interesting about it is that, of course, revolutions devour their children. And this revolution is steadily devouring its children, and it's now essentially devoured Cummings. Cummings has been sacked and rejected by Boris Johnson. And as he's been sacked and rejected by Boris Johnson, he's both turned against Johnson personally with a vitriol that I think is utterly incredible. If you look at the terms in which he speaks of the guy who he essentially made, Boris Johnson, he speaks of him as if he's an alien force. But also what's interesting about what's happening in respect to Brexit is he's starting to pour cold water on Brexit too. Why? Because he knows that that's the only reason why Boris Johnson is there. And he's so now viscerally determined to undermine Boris Johnson. He's psychologically, this is the revolution devouring its children, getting himself into the space where he's even starting to divorce himself from his Brexit projects because he so hates Boris Johnson now. Now that I think could be of really great significance to us in the step-by-step towards rejoin campaign, because the point at which the leaders of the 2016 Leave campaign start disowning Brexit itself is the point at which I think their arguments, the remaining arguments, will collapse like a pack of cards.
Thank you. I want to ask a question now from C. Davison. How do we help UK citizens find the truth about the EU? So are we talking about an educational program, or do we need the help from the EU resources themselves? How can we go about it? And I suppose the other question, which came from Michael Shackleton linked to that, is how do you persuade the British public that the EU is worth rejoining for the values it represents, rather than just as a source of economic advantage? So those two are linked.
It crucially depends upon the leaders who are making the case. Part of the problem we've had in the last 5 years is that the case has been very, very badly made. It was never made in the 2016 referendum on anything other than narrow economic grounds by Cameron and Osborne, essentially. There was never a hearts and minds job on the much wider case for internationalism, engagement with our European partners, the European Union being the best peace project in the history of Europe, and so on. And there was never a social democratic case made for Europe either, because Jeremy Corbyn was basically a Brexiter. He made one speech in support of Europe in the whole of the 2016 referendum, and that was the one where he famously said that he was only 70% in favour. So I think this will stand or fall by the quality of the leaders who make the arguments, and we've got to have a new generation of leaders who are as passionate as Roy Jenkins, Ted Heath, Willie Whitelaw, people of that kind were in the 1970s, which was a large part of the reason why we joined the EEC as then was in the first place.
Thank you for that. I'm aware time is catching up with us, and it really has flown. But I want to ask a final question, if I might, from Peter Lissop, which is to do with EU citizens living in the UK. Should they apply, do you think, for UK citizenship?
Yes.
He comments that 5 million make a very powerful political force.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely should apply. We had 5 million more British citizens who are all, by definition, Europeans. That could, of itself, tilt the balance. And we also need them all to be joining the European movement as well, because that, I think, could be a hugely, and very paradoxically, because you see, the great irony was most of them didn't think it was necessary before, because their essential rights weren't being threatened. So now their essential rights are being threatened, and they have a massive interest in us, first of all, rejoining the customs union and the single market, and then rejoining the EU. That the stronger the larger the number of UK citizens who take that view, obviously, the quicker we'll move on that path. So I could not strongly enough urge all of those of our European residents who have applied for settled status, I couldn't strongly enough urge them to apply also for British citizenship. I think it would be a great and fantastic thing for them, for us, and it could significantly accelerate our path on the step-by-step to rejoin agenda that we've set ourselves.
Thank you very much. I'm
and we
mindful
should be encouraging them. We, the European movement, should be encouraging them to do so. Maybe there's something we could do to help facilitate it. I hadn't really thought about that. It's an interesting question, that. I think there's a very, very good case for us thinking about how we could actually promote British citizenship amongst those with settled status, partly as a big pro-European step that would make it easier in due course for us to rejoin.
Thank you. I think you've answered one of the other questions that was asked along the way, which was, does the European movement welcome EU nationals as members? And I'm guessing yes.
Hugely, without any reservation whatsoever. We can't have enough. No, well, everyone hugely welcome. I will personally send a welcome note.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that. Now it's gotten to 8:30 already, and the time has flown by. But I first of all, thank you very much for what you said. And before we conclude, it might be, if you want to say a few more words to the people on this call, some of whom are members already, but maybe some are waiting to be invited to join and given reasons to do so. This is the opportunity to say more about that. Then back to Susan.
The reason to join is because you'll be joining a like-minded group of very committed and passionate people who are, like you, pro-European, but also critically, as I said earlier, and I can't emphasize strongly enough, the European movement in terms of the club that I and others speaking for you nationally have is only as strong as our membership. So each of you who joins is adding to our strength. And it couldn't be simpler to join. If you just Google join European movement, you go straight onto the website page. It's £3 a month, which is, the price of a Costa coffee. And that hugely adds to our strength. And the only thing it commits you to is supporting the aims and values of the European movement, which is to campaign step by step towards rejoining the European Union. So I really do strongly urge you to do so. And as I say, collectively, the only way we can bring this campaign that we're all engaged in to a successful fruition is to make our collective action much greater than our individual commitments. And that's why we all need to be joining the European movement. And it's the reason why I'm giving up a very substantial part of my time to chairing the European movement. Is I have a very strong sense of duty at the moment, that unless we get this campaigning going from the moment when we left, we'll be unnecessarily prolonging the national agony before what I think is our destiny as a European nation is once again fulfilled, which is to be at the heart of Europe, which must mean at the heart of the European institutions. It's been great to be with you, Peter and Susan. Huge thanks for hosting this meeting. I see we've still got 139 people on the call, which is about as many as we started with, which is a great tribute to your stamina in sticking with it. And I hope all those 139 who aren't members at the moment will join. Thanks very much.
Thank you very, very much, Andrew. And it's really, really warm, thank you. And there's a couple of things that I took away is Brexit isn't finished, and no, it isn't. And that's why we're still here fighting. And maybe Annalisa needs to get a new hard hat, because we do bother her quite regularly, but maybe we're going to redouble those efforts. And a thank you to Grassroots for Europe for co-sponsoring this, and of course to the audience for being here with us. Just wanted to make sure that everybody's got in their diary Wednesday the 18th of August. We have another event that's co-hosted with our friends at Berkshire for Europe, with AC Grayling, oddly enough on our favourite topic, rejoining the EU. So please join us then. And once again, thank you very much to everybody, and watch the newsletters, watch our website, watch our Facebook page, and we will try and keep you advised of everything that's going along. And then, as Andrew suggests, maybe size really does matter, and consider joining the European movement if you haven't already done so. Once again, thank you to all of the people and to the OFE team for the all their effort tonight. Thank you very much.